But now I'll pass to Rob as Chair of the day.
Great. Thanks very much, President Catherine. Well, it's not the sort of thing we think about every day, human rights, but when you think about what it covers every aspect of a civil society, civil democratic liberal society like ours. It involves civil, political, and economic, social, and cultural areas of our society. And it also looks after discrimination against people, against race, their sexual preferences, aged, women, and disabled, and children. So it's an incredibly comprehensive range of areas that need to be covered. And a lot of the time we just take them for granted, but they are so important. So we're very privileged today to have Lorraine Finlay here, who is currently the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, the office being in Sydney, but she's currently based in Canberra. But prior to joining the Commission, Lorraine worked as a lawyer and an academic specialising in human rights and public law. Her most recent roles have been Senior Human Trafficking Specialist with the Australian Mission to ASEAN, and also a law lecturer at Murdoch University. In her academic role, Lorraine has lectured in areas including criminal law, constitutional law, and international human rights. And she's been recognised with a number of national and university awards for her teaching and research. Before moving to academia, Lorraine worked as a state prosecutor with the Office of the DPP in Western Australia and at the High Court of Australia, initially as a legal research officer and later as a judge's associate. Lorraine is a former Singaporean scholar, being awarded a dual Masters in Law from New York University, majoring in Justice and Human Rights, and the National University of Singapore, majoring in International and Comparative Law. Lorraine, you'll also be pleased to hear, has been actively involved in a variety of community organisations, including being a former member of the Rotary Club of Canberra Sunrise. So she's familiar with how we work and what we do. Lorraine was also a member of the Executive Committee of the National Council of Women in WA from 2011 to 19, and a board member of the Isham Multicultural Women's Health Services from 2013 to 18. She's previously been awarded Centenary Medal and the WA Law Society Youth Community Service Award for her volunteer work. So I think you will understand from that she's incredibly qualified for the position, and we will look forward to hearing from her about her work today. Thanks, Lorraine.
Well, good afternoon to everybody in person and also online. It's a real pleasure to join you here at the Rotary Club of Melbourne. And I'd like to thank particularly President Catherine Baxter and also Stephen Rando for the kind invitation to join you here today. And if you'll give me one moment of indulgence to welcome your newest member, Dr. Dimitrios Salapassis. We share a passion for ethical and responsible technological innovation. And you may not realise it yet, but you have a member who will contribute so much to your club, both in his professional capacity, but also through his commitment to community and service. So congratulations on being inducted today. And I'd like to begin by echoing the earlier acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. As was mentioned before, I have a connection to Rotary that stretches back, and I don't want to date myself, but almost 20 years. And it was when I moved from Perth to Canberra as a young law graduate to go and work at the High Court of Australia that I realised the Rotary Club of Canberra Sunrise happened to hold their weekly breakfast meetings in the High Court Cafe. And as somebody who knew nobody in Canberra other than my then fiance, now husband, joining the Rotary Club for me was about not only continuing the idea of service and volunteering, but actually surrounding myself with community and fellowship. And for me, the community and the friendship that I found through my membership of Rotary was enormously beneficial and something that I continue to value. Now, a lot has changed in my life over the last 20 odd years, not least including my being appointed as Australia's 8th Human Rights Commissioner at the end of 2021. But what hasn't changed across that time is my continued belief in the importance of community, of volunteering, and of service to others, and the absolutely critical role that I think organisations like Rotary continue to play in bringing communities together. And if we look around Australia today, that role has never been needed more. Both Rotary International, which was founded in 1905, and this very club, which I believe was established in 1921, actually predate our modern framework of human rights, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights only being formally adopted in 1948 as a direct result of the atrocities of World War II. Last year marked the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's a really timely opportunity for us all to reflect on the continued relevance of that document, but also the future of human rights and some of the challenges that we're facing both here in Australia and globally. And that's what I really wanted to focus on during our time together today. Because I think it's fair to say, and Rob actually said it in the introduction, that far too many of us in Australia, not all, but far too many of us take human rights for granted. And we go through our day-to-day lives without really thinking about human rights and perhaps naively just assuming that they have been, will be, and always will be into the future protected. Far too many Australians take the view that freedom is the default position and that human rights, both in Australia and around the world, will inevitably always move forward in a positive trajectory. Unfortunately, that simply isn't true. When we think about both the broader trends of human history, but also the current geopolitical circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I think it's incredibly important for us to stop and reflect on the fact that while human rights are incredibly important, they're not inevitable. We've lost sight of what a remarkable period of history we've actually been living through. And while this certainly isn't universal, what a remarkable story the Australian story actually is for the vast majority of us. The relative peace and prosperity that we've known, so many of us, for almost our entire lives, is actually unparalleled in the human experience. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a really good example of this, because it's almost a mark of how far we've come in a relatively short amount of time in terms of embedding human rights ideals, that we actually forget just what a milestone this document is, what it actually means, and how extraordinary it is that it actually happened. To have the nations of the world actually come together and recognise that the basic rights and freedoms are the inherent birthright of each and every human being in the world, regardless of their background, regardless of where they live, regardless of who they may be. That's extraordinary. To have the governments of the world come together and recognise that human rights should be protected by the rule of law and that government power should be limited to allow for the protection of those rights. Even if, and I'll talk about this in a moment, that's an ideal that we're still really needing to deliver on. The very fact that that declaration was made, it contains revolutionary ideas that are very much the exception rather than the rule when we think about the full arc of human history. But having said that, and I do want to note right from the start that I promise you, a person who tends to err on the side of optimism. I do think we need to be very realistic about the real challenges that we're facing at the moment in Australia and around the world when it comes to human rights. We need to recognise, for a start, that not all countries and not all people share our commitment to the universality of human rights. The growing democratic decline right around the world means that human rights and freedoms are increasingly under challenge. And that means they need to be actively and openly defended by those of us who share a common belief in their intrinsic value. And while Australia is far from perfect when it comes to human rights, and I'll come back to that in a moment, I do also think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that by world standards, we do have a remarkable story to tell as a stable, peaceful, and prosperous democracy, and as a country that is in so many respects a leader when it comes to human rights. I am very focused in my role as Australia's Human Rights Commissioner in wanting to improve our position when it comes to human rights, wanting to make sure that human rights are delivered for everyone, everywhere, every day in Australia. And I know we're not at that point. But at the same time, I am really proud to be Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, because overwhelmingly the story we have to tell is a positive one, both in terms of what we've done, but also in terms of what we're hoping to achieve in the future. And if I can give just two examples, one local and one international. If we look at Australia nationally, the 2023 annual report by the Global Rights Project, which draws upon the world's largest quantitative human rights database to compare practices across 195 countries, their most recent report ranked Australia second, equal second, behind only Finland when it comes to our overall human rights practices. And in a report where 60% of countries around the world actually achieved an F grade, that's an extraordinary result. And if we look at things from a global perspective, we're a founding member of the United Nations. We're a signatory to the majority of core human rights treaties across the human rights framework. We're the 12th largest contributor to the United Nations annual budget. And we appointed our inaugural ambassador for human rights last year. We're not perfect, but there are positive things that we can draw on and be proud of. Acknowledging our shortcomings shouldn't mean that we don't also recognise our achievements. And aspiring to build a country that is better and fairer in the future doesn't mean we also shouldn't recognise the things that are great about what we're doing in the present. But having said that, I also just wanted to take a moment to note that, of course, it is true that there are numerous examples where Australia is failing to live up to its values when it comes to human rights, and where we're failing to live up to our international commitments. And by giving a few examples, I'm not meaning to suggest that they're the only ones or that there aren't other issues that are equally as critical and important, particularly to the people affected. But if we look, for example, at the fact that we've had over 15 years of closing the gap targets, and yet we still know that for a significant number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in this country, there is a significant gap of entrenched inequality and discrimination. That should be unacceptable in modern day Australia. Despite evidence, and we were talking about this at the table earlier, that punitive law and order responses don't address the root causes of crime or make our community safer in the longer term, we continue to think that tougher penalties are the answer to youth crime and will somehow keep us safe. But across our country, we know that youth justice systems and youth detention centres are in crisis. Whether we look at Don Dale in the Northern Territory, at the Ashley Youth Detention Centre in Tasmania, or in my home state, the Banksia Hill Youth Detention Centre, where just in the last few days, we had the tragic news of yet another teenager taking their life while they were in custody. Again, these are things that shouldn't be happening in Australia. And despite ratifying the optional the optional protocol on the Convention Against Torture, OPCAT, back in 2017, we still haven't met our treaty obligations. We failed to meet our extended compliance deadline that fell due in January last year, noting that we actually had longer than any other country in the world to meet those treaty obligations. And we're one of only 2 countries in the world, Rwanda being the other one, who have had the United Nations Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture actually terminate a country visit to our country because of the lack of cooperation they received when they came in September 2022. This is also the reality when you look at the global picture. When we reflect on 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we can have enormous optimism and pride in some of the rapid improvements that have happened. But at the same time, we also need to recognise that there is example after example after example where the world is falling short of the promises that were made in that document. And again, just to give 2 examples, despite us knowing the horror that war brings, We're watching while that horror continues to be visited on far too many innocent civilians in so many parts of the world. The 2024 Global Peace Index reported that there are currently 56 conflicts involving at least one state, which is the most since World War II. And that 92 countries are involved in conflicts outside of their own borders. And again, despite Article 4 of the Universal Declaration telling us that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude, and despite most people thinking that slavery is something that's been consigned to history, we know the most recent statistics estimate that over 50 million people around the world on any given day are living in conditions of modern slavery. And before you say, well, Lorraine, that's terrible, but that's a problem for other people in other places, the estimates are that 41,000 of those people are living right here in Australia. The idea that 41,000 people are estimated to be living in slavery in Australia, how is that something that we can ever accept? So when we reflect on 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's important to recognise there's been enormous progress in a relatively short amount of time. There is an enormous amount to be positive about and hopeful about, but we still have a really long journey ahead of us if we truly want to translate the promise of that document into reality. So how do we meet those challenges? And how do we improve human rights in Australia? When you're confronted with all of those important issues, all of those challenges, the enormity of what's ahead of us, it's really easy to be completely overwhelmed and to withdraw and start thinking, well, what can I as an individual actually do? How can I really make a difference? And the key message that I wanted to leave you with today is that my main concern isn't actually about any one specific human rights issue. There are many that are incredibly important. But my biggest concern is a broader concern about how we talk about human rights in Australia and the way that we approach public discourse more generally. And that's this. As a nation and as a world, we're facing some really big challenges. And yet, we've never been more fractured, and our public discourse has never been more fractured. We are so quick to assume the worst of each other. We are so quick to cancel rather than to persuade. And we seem to have lost the will to try and find common ground with our fellow men and women. We no longer separate the person from the idea. And the idea that you could be friends with somebody who you might disagree with on really important issues, well, that's increasingly seen as actually being morally objectionable and a sign of impurity rather than something that's virtuous. In my view, these things diminish our ability to meet the policy challenges we face. They diminish our practical ability to actually improve human rights, and they diminish our democracy. All ideas, even the most unassailable truths, benefit from being tested and challenged. Reasonable people can disagree about really important ideas, even about important ideas concerning human rights. Engaging with different perspectives and trying to understand different worldviews, even those views that you vehemently disagree with, that's actually critical in helping you to solidify your own opinions, to strengthen your arguments, and ultimately to find ways of moving forward and persuade people about the path that you think should be taken. We spend a lot of time, and rightly so, talking about the value of diversity. But to my mind, encouraging diversity of perspective is actually one of the most important forms of diversity. Encouraging diversity of thought is one of the most important things we can do if we actually want to strengthen practical outcomes. So ultimately, my message today is if we want to actually implement the promises of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and strengthen human rights in Australia, the first step is to be prepared to actually listen and learn from each other, to break free from our tendency to lock into tribal positions, and to be willing to approach challenging conversations and issues in a spirit of constructive engagement. And in all of that, we need to remember that ultimately human rights is meant to be a unifying concept. It shouldn't be something that's weaponized. It shouldn't be something that becomes a tool of partisan politics, and it shouldn't be something that's used to divide us. Human rights, the idea that all of us are equal in dignity, that all of us are deserving of respect, and that all of us have an inherent value and freedoms and rights that need to be respected and fulfilled. That's a really powerful unifying concept. That doesn't mean there won't ever be different perspectives when it comes to human rights. But if we can focus on those unifying concepts as really being the foundations of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, it should allow us to find common ground, whatever those other differences might be. And that brings me back to Rotary, which is where I'll finish. Because at the end of the day, that focus on bringing people together from different backgrounds, different professions, in a spirit of friendship and service, and that focus on taking shared responsibility for actually building a better world locally, that's what Rotary is all about. And ultimately, that's human rights in action. And I was thinking, as I was hearing some of the introductory remarks, to the words that Eleanor Roosevelt said when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was first introduced. And she was asked, where do human rights begin? And her response was, well, they begin in small places close to home. As members of Rotary, each and every one of you evidences the truth of that statement in the things that you do every day. Human rights isn't always about the big treaties or what happens in Geneva or New York or those big movements. At its heart, human rights is about how we treat each other day to day, and the way we bring human rights to life, the way we advance human rights in Australia, and the way we build up to addressing those big issues is from each of us deciding to live those values in our daily lives, to treat other people with kindness, with empathy, with respect, and to find that common humanity that brings us all together. That's what Rotary does every day. That's what Rotarians do every day. And so I wanted to thank you for the work that you've done, for the work that you're going to do in the future, because I think that the work that you are doing is an essential part of actually bringing human rights to life and delivering on the promise of human rights in a very tangible way for everyone, everywhere, every day. But thank you so much for having me here this afternoon, and I look forward to talking to you some more.
Well, thanks very much for that. And it's, as was being said, it's something that's responsibility of everybody. But it would be great if that sort of speech could go across to America and talk about the politics, about how they have it, but we could only hope. With time for questions, though, we've got the microphone coming around. Right.
Thank you for your talk. I wonder if you could help me to rank Australia as a human rights nation. The Americans think that they are the great leaders in the field, and they're very good at giving people the right to have guns so they can shoot prospective presidents. But at the same time, they will criticize our existing president over there for being too old for the job, which in Australia we would call an ageist remark. And they will criticize the prospective Democrat president as being too black, too Indian in her background, and various other things which would never happen in Australia. And it seems to me that Australia is a very free country, and that our respect for one another is at a very high level. But I wonder, how do we stand in the world stakes as a human rights nation?
Oh, look, there is actually so much in that question, because on the one hand, we are a leader in human rights. And if you look at, for example, that 2023 human rights database, it ranked us equal second. And on all of the different rankings that you can find that measure human rights in various different ways, Australia is at the very top echelon of countries in terms of our performance. But having said that, for the individuals who find their human rights aren't being protected, or who are finding themselves in situations where they are vulnerable, where they're being subject to discrimination, where they're being detained, where there are all sorts of things happening that show human rights aren't being delivered to those people. It actually doesn't matter where Australia ranks on an international table because their experience is very different. So I'm very conscious with respect to human rights that we can generalise, and I'm very proud of the role Australia plays in so many respects. But at the same time, there are so many examples where that isn't delivering for individuals or communities in Australia and where we need to do better. And I think that's really what I would hope is the measure of Australia, that we can always recognise where there are shortcomings, that we can be very open about that, but more importantly, we can work to improve it and hold ourselves accountable for how we do that. Because I think you are right to say Australia is a country where the level of respect for each other on the whole is actually very high. You know, we are one of the most successful multicultural countries in the world. Our level of social cohesion by world standards is something we should be really proud of, but that doesn't happen by accident, and that doesn't inevitably stay the same. It's something we constantly have to work on. And one of the things I am really concerned about, particularly in recent time, is we're seeing some pretty significant cracks in that. And I think we need some very concerted efforts amongst all of us to ensure that we address those issues and that we actually do create an Australia where those human rights are being realised, not just for some of us, but for all of us across the board, because that's what human rights ultimately is all about. Yeah.
Lorraine, a quick one. We don't have a Bill of Rights in this country, one of the few countries that doesn't have a Bill of Rights. Is that a priority for the Commission, and would it make a difference?
It's such an interesting question. So the Australian Human Rights Commission completed a project called Free and Equal, and it's a project that recommended the creation of a Human Rights Act. That's a conversation that is happening nationally at the moment. A parliamentary committee recommended a National Human Rights Act. And I think having that conversation about how do we best protect human rights in Australia is incredibly important. The flip side of that is when the framers were drafting up the Australian Constitution, they didn't just forget about a Bill of Rights, and they didn't decide not to include one because they didn't like human rights. They actually determined that the best way to protect human rights was through a robust parliamentary democracy. And so when you look at things like representative and responsible government, separation of powers, judicial independence, federalism, etc., there are a significant number of rights protecting features inbuilt into our Constitution. So I think the conversation about human rights, the question of do we need a Bill of Rights Act, is an important one. I don't think the fact that everyone else has had one is a reason to do it. I think we need to look more substantially at it than that. But I also think we need to have a broader conversation about how do we ensure that all parts of our framework are working appropriately, because, for example, I think parliamentary reform could achieve a lot in terms of better protection of human rights. I think there are different things we could do in federalism to make sure that we don't have different systems of youth justice, for example, around the country that are often conflicting and contradicting each other, and have a more unified approach to something like that. So there are a whole variety of things I think we could do.
Hi, Lorraine, Philip. A good hot question for you. And my question would be, to what extent would, say, our Prime Minister or our Minister for Immigration consult the Human Rights Commission when it comes to, say, something like the 3,000 Palestinians coming in without an interview, is what the media says, and on a tourist visa? And what sort of precedent does that then set for the country? And so my question then is, what involvement does the Human Rights Commission have in something like that?
Yeah, I think at a general level, so without focusing on any one particular issue, at a general level, we engage with the broad range of government departments, government ministers, the full apparatus on a whole variety of issues. Some of that's done on a very formal basis. Some of it's done a little bit less formally. But in relation to immigration, for example, I lead our work in relation to immigration and asylum seekers. We have regular meetings with the department where we are consulted on a whole range of issues and where we are able to raise issues with them. We also have a complaints mechanism where individuals are able to bring complaints to us, and we're able to work through those in almost a quasi-judicial type of way before things potentially proceed to court. So there is range of mechanisms that build in consultation. Does the government always listen to us? Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. I think a really great example, if I can just give one from the last few days, is the announcement by the Prime Minister that they weren't going to include questions around LGBTQIA plus Australians in the census. Our Sex Discrimination Commissioner, my colleague Anna Cody, was, I think, on the media the second that announcement was made, questioning why that decision had been made and expressing her concern about it. And while I wouldn't say she was the only reason for the decision being changed, her voice was really important in terms of giving that human rights perspective. And we now see a change in that position, which I think is a really positive outcome. So the Australian Human Rights Commission, I think, plays an important role in terms of that consultation always being there, but also being able to bring an independent view to things, because we're an independent agency. So we are able to stand up and, where needed, criticise the government where we think they are falling short of human rights ideals, and make suggestions, both when requested to by government, but importantly off our own back, in terms of issues that we see or things that we see as needing improvement.
Thanks, Lorraine. I really liked your speech. What I liked most about it was towards the end when you started talking about how we don't want to divide, and actually we need to be conscious about the whole premise of human rights being equality. I'm Steph Hunt. I'm the Liberal candidate for the seat of Melbourne, where we are right now, at the federal level. My opposition being Adam Bandt, the leader of the Greens. And the reason why I mention that is because I have a question around some of the things that have been coming out of politicians in this heated, I guess these heated times with, you know, around issues like Hamas, et cetera. With individuals like the leader of the Greens, where, for example, even the Attorney General, being Labor, has accused him of inciting violence. It goes to the very core of what you were saying, that ultimately we need to keep social cohesion, and that's something I really care about. So how can you, so the question, I always get this in Brighton Rotary as well. So I'm a Rotarian. So the question is, how can you give that beautiful message that you gave to all of us? How can you give that to certain individuals, politicians, people like the leader of the Greens? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. And I'm going to preface it by saying I'm not a politician. I'm going to leave the politics to the politicians, because my job is somewhat different. And so the comments I make are going to be couched in very general terms and certainly not aimed at any one individual or any one political party. But I think you're exactly right that social cohesion is something we all have responsibility for. So I think in my job, I have a role to be going out and talking to as many people as possible and spreading that message. But each of us have roles as individuals, again, in terms of our day-to-day life, in terms of not standing by and being silent when we see things happening. And one of the things that really troubles me when I'm thinking about the rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Australia at the moment, which I think we're seeing very clear evidence of, none of these things reach crisis point in an instant. They gradually build over time. And there are small events or innocuous things that you might walk past in your daily life because it's not my job to deal with that, or it's not really at the point where I need to say anything yet, or it's too uncomfortable to intervene. And the problem is, as a nation and as a globe, we've been there before and we know where it ends, and it doesn't end well. And so I think we really need to all be conscious of the way we're engaging and treating each other, all be looking at what can we do to bring people together and try to recognise that whatever our individual views on issues might be, there is that common humanity that we really need to focus on. But I think we also need to recognise within Australia, we all have a responsibility for building the type of future that we want to pass on to our kids and our grandkids, whether we're in politics or not. And I think the way that we do that is through our day-to-day actions. So, yeah, I'm aware there are so many issues around human rights where people understandably and rightly are passionate and engaged and really wanting to convey the seriousness of the issue through their rhetoric. But I think we also need to be conscious of the impact that can have, and just making sure that we are always focused on differentiating between, for example, those who are responsible for conflicts overseas and everyday people in Australia who actually have no capacity to influence that and are just trying to get on with their day-to-day lives.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, for coming specially to address us today. Much appreciated. My name is Robert Fisher. I find myself being extremely embarrassed about the, I believe, 8,000 or so refugees that we have in our country under temporary visas. I'm curious to know, is there good reason why governments, not just the current government, but previous as well, take so long to process these temporary visas? Is this not a human rights issue?
Yeah. Again, I'm conscious of needing to keep answers short, and there is a lot in that. What I would say is I think there are a number of areas when it comes to Australia's immigration policies where we need to think about how we can do things better. Because, you know, immigration is such an important part of the Australian story. And what really concerns me is that when there isn't that broad-based community support for a strong, positive immigration system, it leads to all sorts of difficulties. And one of the challenges you're mentioning in terms of the delays in processing visas and the sheer numbers that we're faced with, an added issue with that is when you then have a system of mandatory detention that can lead to people being detained for incredibly long periods of time. And I'm aware you asked about temporary visas, which is a different situation. But the statistic that I've been looking at recently, because we've just completed a report that will be published next month, I believe, but please don't hold me to that. I'm looking at the experiences of women in immigration detention, particularly. Australia is an absolute outlier in terms of the length of time that people spend in immigration detention. We actually measure the overall length of stay in months or years, whereas equivalent countries measure it in days or weeks. And the impact that has on people is extraordinary. So I think there is a lot that we need to do from a human rights perspective to ensure that we have a strong, robust immigration system, but one that respects the dignity of everybody concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Obviously, from the number of questions and the level of questions, you can see it's incredibly important for Rotary because we do support all of those values as well. But thank you for coming today. And I think we've got a very good defender of human rights in Australia now. Thank you. So I have a small gift here, including one from the person who asked the hot question down there. There's a pair of very cool socks here, which will protect you from the cool Canberra weather, made by Phil's business, the 200% Australian, and Rotary as well. So thank you for coming today. Okay, in closing, then I'd just like to thank our visitors and guests for attending, and thanks also to MC Karen Kim and to Tony Batoni for the reflection and the setup and reception teams for your efforts as well. And if you can stay back to help, please do. Catherine's already mentioned next week is the prospective member night, so we've got a week off. But we return on the 18th of September for the head of mission, Damien Cardoni Onisi, from he's the director of United Nations Information Centre in Canberra. So we're looking forward to having him speak. So.